This is chapter 14, section 2, and it's on urban land use. So the objectives today are to describe the urban crisis and explain what people are doing to deal with it, to explain how urban sprawl affects the environment, code word Alabama, next to explain how open spaces provide urban areas with environmental benefits, to explain the heat island effect, and to describe how people use the geographic information system as a tool for land use planning. Urbanization. So, in the previous video, we talked about the idea of an urban area. So, an urban area is an area that has a high density or a large amount of people. And typically, the number used for that is above 2,500 people. Um, Most of the time, when you're talking about urbanization, people are referring to more, maybe a larger number than 2,500. Um, the details, as far as which number isn't so much the point. The idea is just the concentration of people into cities. The taking of people from rural areas where you have more of your farms and your rangeland and things like that, and putting them into your cities where you have big skyscraper type buildings, and there's less space, maybe some more job opportunities there. In your developed countries like the U.S. where we live, urbanization slowed during the second half of the 20th century as far as like the rate of it. In the previous video, we mentioned that this big push from rural to urban areas happened towards the end of the 19th century, and then towards the earlier parts of the early to mid part of the 20th century. Whereas in developing countries now, the urbanization process is really starting to pick up steam, where you're having more and more people move from rural to urban. Now, that's not to say that urbanization isn't still happening in a developed country. It's just the rate, or how quickly it's occurring, isn't as dramatic as in the past. Um, One thing that can happen with urban populations is that if you have cities that are nearby, one large urban area can kind of mold together with another urban area. So an example would be Washington D.C. and Baltimore, or here in Texas, you have Dallas Fort Worth. These two cities where, if you think of think of like a circle or something, where if each of these circles, maybe you can even have a third circle in there, are the perimeters of a city. Um, the outskirts of one city starts meeting up with the outskirts of another city. So outskirts here, outskirts there, and that's going to form these metropolitan areas where you kind of, if you're kind of around this region, it's tough to say, are you DC, are you Baltimore? You kind of start getting a gray area where you just sort of say the DC Baltimore area, or the Dallas Fort Worth area. Um, how urbanization happens is going to really determine the planning of the city. So some cities, especially your cities, that are older, like in the East Coast, they developed before the automobile occurred. So, as a result, these cities, they kind of developed. They had a chance to sort of anticipate these developments with the automobile. They have typically better public transportation set up, that they can kind of handle the growth in traffic, because it starts, that growth in populations happening a little more slowly. Whereas, some of the cities out west, maybe, especially Southwest, where these cities occurred after the automobile was invented, or shortly before. They aren't the cities aren't built, as concentrated. Because think about before the car, you couldn't drive, you couldn't travel 20 miles easily, or 15 miles easily. You built stuff so that you could get to it by, either a short walk, or maybe you had a horse and carriage. And so these older cities are built where, it's a little more compact and everything's closer together. Um, Another thing with some of the older cities is, because again they grow a little more slowly. They kind of had a chance to have a little more thought into how they develop some of their infrastructure, like their roads, like how their rainwater is going to run off. Planning things like aesthetic value, um, At the very end of this lecture, I'm going to show you a picture of Central Park in New York. So Central Park was this masterly planned park in New York, where that wasn't something that was just dreamed up overnight. There was definitely a lot more, uh, forethought that went into it. Code word Florida. Okay, the urban crisis. So what can happen is if you have this urbanization process, the process of people going from rural to urban areas, and it happens too quickly, you can overwhelm what's known as the infrastructure. So your infrastructure is referring to kind of the things that you might take for granted in a city, the things that are the almost the background of a life in a city. So things like your roads that you need to get to places, your sewers, your railroads, stuff that it may not be as glamorous as, oh, that really cool new skyscraper, but if you want to get to that skyscraper, you need a road. It's all the thing. It's kind of like you could think of the infrastructure. If you think of the school we're in, you might think of your janitorial staff as part of the infrastructure. Imagine like if we didn't have anybody cleaning the schools each night after we went home. You may not notice initially, but as the days and the weeks went on, the school would start building up with trash. It would start getting very, very dirty. So the infrastructure is something that sometimes we take for granted in countries and in cities as a whole, but it's important because if cities don't plan their infrastructure properly for how they predict the growth is going to occur, then they can get into a position where their population is too big for their infrastructure. So you get things like massive traffic jams, um, maybe overflowing sewers or polluted air, not enough green space because the city grew too fast, grew much faster than the city planners intended. And kind of this entire situation that I just described, this overwhelming of the city infrastructure is there's a term for it, and it's termed urban crisis. And this is a widespread problem. That's kind of important to note. It's not just Houston, or I don't know, one city is experiencing this. It's something that's happening all over the world where as the world population just didn't anticipate just how quickly and dramatically the urbanization process, the process of people going from rural to urban areas, was going to occur. Another feature of your urban areas is going to be urban sprawl. So urban sprawl is kind of what you think of when you think of suburbs. It's where you have the city and maybe you have the city proper, like the main street, where a lot of your skyscrapers are, maybe where some of the sports teams are located. And then you have the outskirts of the cities, where the buildings start getting a little more smaller. It's the suburbs, it's where a lot of the people who work inside the city live. And slowly, as you get more and more people going into the city for their work, those people need places to live. Um, and so, slowly but surely, a city, it might start like this, but then, it starts creeping out a little bit here and there, and maybe, the city boundaries are around here. The next thing you know, it's here. And then, you kind of can get the idea. It's just slowly but surely the city keeps expanding. Um, and a consequence of this is going to be land. The land that is being overtaken by the city was previously land that we were using for food production, or land that was providing those ecosystem services that we talked about in the previous video. The filtration of your air, your water, um, things like your parks and your reserves. And so uh, and kind of getting into this next slide here, some cities weren't built with the idea of urban sprawl in mind. And what I mean by that is if you look at the city like Los Angeles or Mexico City, these cities were built in these basins, these kind of low. Um, think of it almost like a bowl, where like the actual city of Los Angeles, the actual city of Mexico is built. It's almost in like a bowl where the outside of the bowl, the rim of the bowl, so the city's built inside this bowl here, and then on the outskirts of this bowl are something like mountain ranges, or actual mountain ranges on the outside of this bowl, where you don't have a whole lot of space for that urban sprawl, for that for expansion of that city. And so you start getting land that, in the outskirts here that wasn't really intended for the city or for anybody to build on it, that because of its proximity or its location to, Los Angeles, to Mexico City, people start trying to build on these slopes. And this land, this, they call it marginal land, this land that um, isn't really very useful land. Maybe you can't grow much food on it. It's on, like, marginal land could be like, say this is a mountain right here. It's like trying to build a house like on the side of a mountain. Like you can imagine. It's got this large slope. How much work it would take to build on an incline like that versus a nice flat plain like that. And so what happens if you try building on this kind of terrain, this type of this area, you can get things like landslides. Think of maybe like a coastal city where you start trying to, if maybe you're on an island or some sort of, on the coast of a continent, and you start building out towards the coast, you can imagine if sea levels rise or you start getting some flooding going on or a hurricane, that land right over by the water could get, flooded out from the ocean. And the only reason you started building on that land was because you didn't really have much place else to build. Okay, some other impacts of urbanization is going to be the idea of a heat island. And so a heat island is referring to this trapping of heat, that occurs in cities. And the reason for this trapping of heat is because, you know, the actual city itself, where you have all these buildings and roads, these buildings and roads are going to absorb and retain heat much longer and much more than vegetation does. So vegetation, if you think of like a nice, like, hot sunny day where it's 100 degrees, and imagine touching a plant, maybe the grass or something, versus touching asphalt or like a parking lot or something. Just from your everyday experience, that parking lot's going to be much hotter than the grass next to it. And that's just because of the molecules that make up the asphalt versus the molecules that make up the plant. And so if you keep adding up all these roads and these buildings and you put them all into one concentrated area, you can imagine you're going to absorb and retain a lot more heat. It's going to be a lot hotter inside that city than if you're out in some open field where you're surrounded by plants and animals that don't retain quite as much heat. Um, Code word Texas. Okay, another important thing with the heat island is that cities themselves also generate more heat than the surrounding countryside. So, obviously think of all the cars that are in cities. All those cars, they're burning fuel, and one of the byproducts of burning fuel is heat, and so that heat goes into the city, and that heat doesn't spread outside the city very well because of what I just mentioned. The roads and buildings that are holding the cars that are generating the heat are absorbing and retaining that heat much better than grass would. So you can kind of imagine it as something of like a snowball effect that can start occurring with this urbanization process. Okay, so what are some consequences of the heat island? Um, Obviously, it just being hot is sort of an obvious consequence. Like, you don't want to be surrounded by all this heat. You could have things like heat stroke that come from heat stroke is it's basically like severe dehydration. You get your body gets so worked up from all this heat where you're trying to sweat and evaporate all this heat that your body's taking in, that you just, you can lead to death. It can lead to you having to go to the emergency room. So heat stroke is a big consequence. Another one that is starting to become more appreciated is the effect of heat islands on the local weather patterns. So, if inside the city, you have a heat island, you have this concentration of hot air, that hot air is going to rise. And anytime you have hot air, so if you have hot air, you're going to have more water. Hot air holds way more water vapor than cold air does. And the reason for that is because, think back to, middle school or even elementary grade science, where you have all these particles. if you forgive my drawing of particles. What happens when particles get energy when they heat up is they start moving around more. If you follow my cursor, they're moving around more. And as they move around more, there's more space in between these particles. And that space will allow things like water to collect inside of there. Whereas colder air doesn't have as much space in between there because the particles aren't moving around as much. So there's less space for the water molecules to get in between there. So if you have this hot air rising, this hot air, almost like a vacuum cleaner, brings with it this water vapor. And as this hot air rises up over the city, it's going to eventually cool down. And that, think of your water cycle. You have evaporation, uh, and you have condensation, and then finally you kind of have the final end of it, precipitation, or the rain clouds that drop all the rain. And so, these major cities that have this heat island effect, they can have much more rainfall than would otherwise be necessary. A way that you can kind of moderate the heat island effect is by planting trees for shade. Because again, the trees, your plants aren't going to retain and absorb that heat nearly as much as your asphalt. Also, if you can have rooftops that reflect rather than retain heat, so using smart building materials that reflect off this heat rather than holding it all in, that's kind of a way that you can try to reduce it. Code word DC, like the city. Okay, so because of all of these things that we just talked about, the importance of land use planning comes into play. So, land use planning is just talking about the idea of having these policies and these activities that are established that kind of tell you how we can use land. So, a lot of it, it's essentially these policies that are set up by the government, sort of laws and rules and regulations that just prevent, any business or any one individual from just taking some piece of land and doing whatever they want on it. Just trying to make sure that, trying to help stop the bleeding, so to speak, that can come from this urbanization process. Making sure that we can at least try to be somewhat smarter with how we're using our land. Making sure that, okay, if somebody wants to build an apartment complex on this land, trying to make sure, okay, is this land appropriate for an apartment complex, or is this land important land for a park, or is this land used as a floodplain for if we have excess rain, we need this land to hold this flood water. So if you build an apartment complex on it, then where is that water then going to go, or what's going to happen to that apartment complex? Is it going to get flooded out? Um, and with this, so if you're a developer, you're someone wanting to build on this land, you have these detailed reports that you have to fill out and take to some sort of government organization like a city hall type thing to get approval for whatever you want to build. And you know the public can have a right to comment on these reports. And you know I have a friend in the construction business, and he complains about this all the time with his roofing business. And yeah, it's kind of inconvenient to some degree, but again, it's just trying to make sure that we're using our land appropriately, and ultimately trying to prevent the abuse of land that would occur if we didn't have systems like this in place. Okay, so intelligent design. So to get an idea of how we can use land um, and make sure we're using it appropriately, we can use something called a geographic information system. So a GIS is going to be this computer system that can store, manipulate, and allow you to view different types of geographic data. Um, I know that sounds kind of vague and fuzzy, but let me jump to a picture of a GIS to maybe help give you an idea of it. Um, so you have these different layers. So think of it as like these transparencies where first you want to start with, okay, you might tell the GIS, give me, all of the streets, in a certain area. And so it'll give you this image of all the streets being laid out. You're like, okay, so that's where the streets are at. And you're like, okay, now give me the next thing. Okay, GIS, give me all the buildings. And so the GIS will add in all the buildings. It almost reminds me something of how our maps apps are set up today, where you kind of can edit, you can use these different filters to see different types of data, and you can have as little or as much data present as you want. So that, you could add in vegetation, so you can get an idea of, okay, what kind of greenery is in this certain area. So as I mentioned earlier, so you can kind of see, okay, this area has a lot of, this might be a little forest right here. So is it appropriate to cut down this forest area and build this? I don't know. I keep using apartment complex, but build this apartment complex, considering that we don't have as much of a forest area outside of here, just trying to, or maybe can we try to, only cut down half of it, just trying to make sure you have a very good idea of what you're getting yourself into with certain projects. Code word Missouri. Transportation. So a lot of your cities in the U.S. are going to be difficult to travel in without a car. So in Houston, where I currently live, I mean, it's almost impossible to get anywhere without a car. The public transport system isn't quite as well set up, because, as I mentioned, it's a city that was built, right around the invention of the automobile, and so people are used to the luxury of having a car to drive around, rather than cities in Europe that were built way before cars, where you had, um, everything was a little more in walking distance. And in a city like Europe, you have narrower roads, so even if you wanted to have more cars there, you just don't have the space. So you have to come up with a more innovative or more efficient solution. Okay, and I've already alluded to this. The mass transit systems that are built in cities are going to save you energy, limit the amount of cars. Important thought is reducing air pollution, because all of those cars on the road are reducing your greenhouse gases, and it can contribute to things like acid rain. And then also you can have carpooling. So that's kind of a more practical thing in a city like Houston, where you don't have where it's a little more spread out and you don't have the benefit of a mass transit system. You can try to do more things like carpooling. If, say there's another teacher in my school district who lives near around me who's traveling to school, we could try to ride together. Okay, so kind of nearing the end is the idea of open space. So open space, I've been kind of harping all along about, making sure the heat island, and, oh, we don't want to, the heat island, all these dramatic consequences. So what is something of a solution? And that can be to have more open space. If you have more open space, you're kind of, you're adding in these different areas within a city where you can, sort of relieve some of that heat, if you will. It, almost like, if you have like a pan, making sure the handle, you can grab the handle, as opposed to making the entire pan conducting heat. It's, in other words, kind of putting these different buffers, or these different areas in the city where you can get relief from some of the buildings and the heat that come from that. Um, Perhaps, giving areas for these ecological services to keep existing. The filtering of your water through the ground, making sure you're removing some of the carbon dioxide out of the air, providing places for people to bicycle and hike. So the aesthetic value uh, that come from your green belts and you're having more open space. Um, and let's see, anything else I want to mention here? Reducing drainage problems is something I do want to keep emphasizing, because if you have too much concrete in a city, the question is, where is that water going to go? And if you keep building on land that's surrounding a city, you're kind of just you're going to keep pushing that water, and that water is going to start collecting. And so, that's another thing with the open space, is making sure you have enough open, grassy type area, where if you have a massive, um, rainfall, or something of a flood, you can try to collect that rainwater to reduce the impact of it. And this is a picture of Central Park. So this is kind of, one of the more famous, concepts of an open space in a city. So rather than, most cities have parks, like maybe smaller parks, so like something like this, that would just be randomly spaced out in the city. New York doesn't so much have that. They just have one giant park that the entire city shares. Some good and bads to it. nonetheless it's a pretty fascinating and beautiful idea. If you've never been to Central Park, definitely something to recommend. Okay, that's gonna do it for this lecture.